Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hi, and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can stop by and discover all of the products and services that I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, and psychic readings. You can also get information about my new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, as well as my re-released book, Dark Angels, an Insider's Guide to Ghost Spirits and Attached Entities, now available on Kindle. Woohoo! Okay, you can listen to Just Energy Radio every Thursday evening on the Inception Radio Network, live on the Inception Radio Network. But if you've missed a show, you can check out our archives at www.justenergyradio.com. While you're there, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep you informed of all of the great programming we have coming up for you here on Just Energy Radio. Other ways to keep track of what's going on is that you can like us on Facebook. We always post the upcoming show as well as the archive, the YouTube archive of the show. And so if you're a YouTube person because you like listening at work or while you're driving down the freeway in your car, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Just Energy Radio. And another way to hear this show, as well as all of the programming here on Inception Radio Network, is to download their app for your smartphone. And you can also chat from that app as well, which is really cool. Okay, I'm just trying to think if there's any other announcements I need to make today. I don't think so. So we're just going to get to it. So today we're going to be talking about the lost secrets of the ancients, and to do that, we're going to have Keith Hunter on. So let me tell you a little bit about Keith, and we will get him on the air. Keith M. Hunter is an independent researcher with degrees in psychology and sociology who has delved into the mysteries surrounding the origins of sacred measures and the base 60 mathematical system of the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians. Keith has built upon and expanded the pioneering research of Bruce Cathy, examining the Earth energy grid matrix, and has made critical breakthroughs over the past decades in decoding the esoteric physics underlying not only the placement of ancient structures such as the Great Pyramids, but more. His book is The Lost Age of High Knowledge, Evidence of an Advanced Civilization Prior to Recorded History, and his webpage is www.ancient-world-mysteries.com. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Keith Hunter. Hi, Keith. How are you?
Hello, Rita. I'm not too bad.
Not too bad? Doing pretty good today?
Yes, it's okay. It's about 7 o'clock at the moment in England.
Well, cool. So we're just going to start kind of easy. Since you haven't been on the show before, I'd like for you to kind of introduce yourself to the listeners and how you got interested in ancient history and ancient measurements, because it seems like a lot of your work, okay, I'll admit this, has to do with numbers, which I was kind of like a math flunky. So excuse me there. But how did you get interested in this whole area?
I think everybody has their own little story, and there were several things when I was really young that I was interested in, like astronomy. Even bought a telescope when I was young, and also technical drawing and architecture. And when I left school, I was definitely pretty good at art and architecture, and as I say, interested in also astronomy. And I went initially into college courses to do with those subjects, but I have to say I took a big change of tack, and then I ultimately ended up taking a degree in psychology and sociology, and that was at the University of Leeds between 95 and 98. I was more interested, I think, at that point in the human mind, and again going in a completely different direction, also to do with society as well. But I also was interested in things like the classics and Greek mythology and those kinds of things like Homer. And I think it was all those subjects, if you will, came together, and I almost speculatively I bought a copy of Nexus magazine. I think this was about 1998, and this is a magazine all about various, you could say, alternative or conspiracy type theory stuff. But I would say that the real history, the real science out there, the kind that is generally suppressed. And it dealt with all these ancient mysteries and about how essentially what we're taught at school isn't what really happened in history. And to this whole idea that there was an advanced civilization many years prior to recorded history. And I would also say another important book that I read at that time was Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods. And that really, touched upon all these kinds of things, especially like a pre-flood civilization and what might have happened about 10,000 BC. So it was looking at those things. But I would say that one of the critical things of interest was looking at how mythology, especially Greek mythology, and their various topics of fighting amongst the gods, the Olympian gods like Zeus and Hera, and how these were also linked into planets and celestial changes, even great Earth changes. And I got into looking a lot more about the planetary side of things, or the celestial side of things, almost going into the subject, if you will, of astrology. But I was interested in particular by one researcher that you mentioned, Bruce Cathy, and he looked basically at some of the mathematics of what is the Sumerians and the Babylonians and their base 60 system. It's like we use degrees for angular measure, and we split up the circle into 360 equal parts. Each degree is split up further into minutes of arc by multiplication by 60. Each degree has 60 minutes of arc, and each minute of arc has 60 seconds of arc. So we refine these as ever more acute angles. So we could say split up the circle into 360 degrees, or 21,600 minutes of arc. Or the other one is it 1,296,000 seconds of arc. So we look at these numbers and we look at them as angular measure. And one of the things that is one of these points that is mentioned in all kinds of standard maths books as a brief little statement. Why do we use 360 degrees? And the answer will be given because the Babylonians and the Sumerians, and these are civilizations which date back to about 3,800 to about 2,000 BC in what is modern-day Iraq. Yes, that area there. These civilizations held that the Earth once had exactly 360 days per year. Now, currently, it's about 365.24218, just slightly under 365 and a quarter days. Now, even though this little point is usually mentioned in many maths textbooks, what it'll usually be followed up with is a statement how the Babylonians and Sumerians, they just used it as an approximation, and the Earth has never really had 360 days per year. And even though they seem to claim it did have, they're completely wrong. And I was looking at this particular issue and looking at the work of Bruce Cathy, because what he was approaching this from, and he did many studies. Again, he was an airline pilot and started writing books on this subject in the 1960s, like The Energy Grid and The Harmonic Conquest of Space and so forth. And he was looking at the flight patterns of UFOs, for example, and he was finding that they, in his area in New Zealand, they appeared to be going along lines, parallel lines, in like a grid matrix, north and south. He linked it to the Earth's magnetic field, and he was finding the intervals between these were tied into these minute of arc units, these ancient units of the Sumerians. And so he was making the first steps into basically finding out that these units of measure for splitting up the circle, or even the surface of the Earth, say, that this is no mere arbitrary thing, that there is an energetic significance to them. And so I looked carefully at his work regarding UFOs and this, and I looked also at the solar system, especially with regards to various ratios. I'll just give you a few little ideas in. Some of these are found in myth as well. I mean, for example, I've just mentioned the importance of the base 60 system. Well, if you look at the orbit of the moon, say, around the Earth, right, the mean distance between centre of the Earth, centre of the moon in its orbit, right, in kilometres it's about 384,404. But if you convert that to statute miles, it's about 238,000 miles or so, yes? If you divide that simply by the radius of the Earth, the equatorial radius at the equator, you get something like 60.29, right? So it's not quite 60 bang on, it's just slightly different. There is in Indian mythology, the Hindu system, they talk about for example, the distance between the Earth and the Sun, right? And they would say, and again, if you take the radius of the Sun, right? There's a physical body, and you do a division sum, distance between Earth and Sun divided by radius, you get just under 216, right? Now, remember the numbers of the base 60 system. We talk about 6 multiplied by 6 is 36, by 6 is 216, then by 6 again, 2196, the main numbers, yes? And so you get these ratios, and when you study the Earth, Moon, the Sun relations and other planets, you will find that they're all just slightly out of harmony, just ever so slightly out of this perfect system which seems to embody these ratios. And what I was looking at was, is there some way in which the solar system, not just the Earth and the Moon, say, but wider, even the solar system, has been dynamically transformed from an ideal, very harmonious system to its current system? And the key breakthroughs I made in this area was to find out that there are physical laws of proportion which even a scientist would grasp and recognize, because they're very similar to the law of proportion that was found by Johannes Kepler. He lived in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, and he found a law which seemed to relate all of the planets in the solar system around the Sun. It's generally referred to as his third law. And just to give the listeners an idea of what he found, it's basically a law that connects up various aspects of planets based on ratios. So, for example, if we take the orbital period of Mars, time for Mars to go once around the Sun, it's about 686.7 days. If we divide that by the Earth's 365 and a quarter, we'll get this value 1.88 and a bit, yes? He uses a series of powers. So in other words, we multiply numbers by themselves. So if we get that ratio and we simply square it, multiply it by itself, and then we reduce it to the third root, so we're asking ourselves the question, what number multiplied by itself a certain number of times gives us the answer. So what number multiplied, for example, 3 times, right, gives us this 1.88. So we reduce it to the third root, right? we end up with 1.523. And that is the ratio between the mean distance between Mars and the Sun and the Earth and the Sun. I realise it's a subtle law, and I would say if people do go to my website, ancientworldmysteries.com, I do have a couple of basic chapters on this. But the upshot of it is, without getting too involved in the mathematics, what I found was that there were laws of proportion of the same type as Kepler's, right, relating different components of a planet, either the physical radius or the distance between the planet and the Sun, or the time taken to go once around the Sun. I found that you could connect up various components like this as ratios and use certain powers, and you can actually see that if you use these, you can back transform the system to this perfect harmony. And it led me to think there's been a fundamental change in all the values of the solar system. And I even ended up tying this into such as the speed of light. And I found a law which seemed to indicate the speed of light itself has changed over time, that it's got faster. And also things like what we might consider constants, like the gravitational constant, that too would appear to have changed. So and even temperature scales, we refer to absolute zero as being minus 293.16 degrees, yes? Now, it might be interesting to note that if you do 1 divided by that and you turn it upside down, right, you get a value which is as close as its numeric sequence, if you will, yes? In its numeric sequence to 360 or 36. If you do the 1 over 273, you get about 3.66 to the minus 3. But again, it makes me think that that very interval between absolute zero and the freezing point of water, say, yes, has changed. So I ended up realizing that we have suffered a radical change in the solar system, but I also found that it was not a random one. You could hang all of these changes on a key measure, and this has to do with the moon. If we're looking for
let me cut in here a minute, because you had me thinking, and I don't want to forget my question, because you kind of started off this conversation. I'm hoping I'm not like totally destroying your train of thought here. But you started off the conversation talking about that 360 day cycle that the Sumerians talked about, but they weren't really the only ones. I mean, the Egyptians talked about a 360-day cycle. The Maya talk about a 360 plus 5 day, which to me, I mean, that was my intuitive look at it, was why would you have a 360 plus 5 day? That just doesn't, if they're smart enough to track the stars the way that they were, they could add 360 and 5 and make it 365. You know?
Oh yes,
that would only make sense.
There's no way they would have not known that. And you're right. Many different cultures had this information, and they knew that. You mentioned the Egyptians, for example. The Egyptians had a year of precisely 360 days, right? 360, but then they added on 5 other days, and these were considered unlucky days. And they had this story, the Egyptians, to explain it in myth. Basically, once upon a time, in the early stages of the universe, when gods and goddesses were still forming, the sun god, Ra, had heard this prophecy that the sky goddess Nut would give birth to some children who would depose him. And so he cast a curse upon Nut and said that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. And there were 360 days to the year. So what she did was she went to see this wisdom god, Tota, and he went to the moon, right, the moon itself, and played a game of drafts with the moon. And the stakes were that if Tota won, he would win a measure of the moon's light. The measure was a fraction of 1 over 72, right? And as a result of winning, he basically caused the moon to move away from the Earth, to get smaller in the sky, and it could no longer shine its light all the time. It had to go into hiding and periodically show itself. And this is where we get the phases of the moon from. But as a result of the moon moving away and getting smaller in the sky, this had an effect on the Earth. Tota gave this extra light, if you will, to the sky goddess Nut. And as a result, it increased the number of days in a year from 360 to 365 and a bit. And she gave birth on these extra days. And each of these extra days are named as children, like Osiris, Set, Horus, you see now, Isis as well. And is there a Horus the Younger? There's basically 5 gods. And as a result of this, she gave birth, she became pregnant, and so we think of people, obviously women, when they get pregnant, they swell up, yes? The physical size of the Earth also expanded. And just to give you an indication of these laws of proportion, we look at the Earth itself, via, let's say, the work of Bruce Cathy. We can basically split up the Earth at the equator, right, into units of, and this emphasises how special units of measure are that we use. Imperial units, we base them on feet, fathoms, inches, and statute miles. Our units, imperial units used in the UK, the US, these are not arbitrary, and they are actually based upon the ideal Earth system, right? I mean, even the word geometry means Earth measure, right? So a fathom we are familiar with is 6 feet, right? So if you were to have a unit of, say, 1,000 fathoms, 6,000 feet, we were going to have this as a standard unit. If you were to measure the equator of the Earth in this unit, right, the numeric sequence you'll get is 21,914.11 of these units of 6,000 feet, yes? If you basically take the current number of days per year, 365.24218, etc., divide by 360, yes, and get that ratio there, which is about 1.01456, and you reduce the current equator by that same ratio, it goes back to practically dead on 21,600. And again, this harmonious number. So it tells us there's something special about our units of measure. And I regard that as a true physical law. When the Earth increased from 360 to its present, the Earth itself physically expanded. And that myth of the Egyptians is no arbitrary myth. They really did indicate the Earth physically expanded. And so we have these stories, mythological stories about gods being born or gods fighting with one another. And they're subtle stories, and they do refer to very precise celestial changes, but you do have to decode them. So, what I found was that, and these are all discussed in my book, all the laws of proportion I propose as a system which very harmoniously seem to back transform the Earth and the Moon, even the Moon itself. The Egyptians had a system of 360 days per year, but the Moon also was precisely 30 days per month. Now, currently, the Moon is about 29.53058 days. It's slightly under 30. Using combination of powers 11 and 12, and again using the Earth's change from its current value, from 360 to its current value, you can get that ratio, raise it to the 12th power, reduce it to the 11th root, and the ratio you have, which is about 1.0158 or so, that ratio there, very exactingly, is the ratio of change that takes the Moon from precisely 30 days to its current value. And the error rate on that is about 0.3 of 1 second of time. So that is an incredible level of accuracy. And so these are the kinds of discoveries I made. But if I might just move on, because what I ultimately was looking at was this idea of the basic principle of astrology. We've got all these systems that people may be familiar with, and it's the basic idea is that the sun, the moon, the other planets, they directly influence the Earth. They influence civilization, peaks and troughs, so to speak, behavior of people, but they're also connected with natural disasters. And you sometimes see people saying, when a star is or the wandering stars, as the planets were sometimes referred to, when they're behind or in front of a certain constellation, there'll be a plague on Earth, or there'll be a famine, or there'll be a big shaking movement of those kinds of things. I looked to see if I could essentially, in a high precision way at least, try to validate astrology. I didn't look at the human behavior aspect and talk about how we might have personalities based on when we were born. I decided to look at specifically natural disasters and specifically earthquakes. Now,
let me ask a question, because you have me thinking, but it's in line with what you're saying.
Yeah.
So we have the change that happened, and I have kind of a sub question in here also. That happened between the orbits of the Earth and the Moon, and just one of my sub questions that you can kind of throw in. Why do you think that happened, or how do you think that happened? There are people that kind of bring up Velikovsky's work, that something came into the solar system and disturbed it. So that's one piece. But you mentioned earlier about that the solar system was harmonious, and because of these changes, it's slightly off. And I do energy work, and so I really understand energy and energy movement, and I can conceptually get the idea that kind of like electrons going around the nucleus of an atom. They all have fixed orbits, but if you throw the orbit off, what impact is it going to have on the stability of the atom? And it kind of feels like what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is these changes to our planet and what impact it had on the other planets, I don't know, maybe you'll answer that, changed the way that our solar system is acting by itself.
Well, what I'd say is, and I know where you're coming from with Velikovsky's work, you could even bring in Zecharia Sitchin and his work about Nibiru as an intruder body coming in as well, and some of the theories there. But I'm actually not going down that route. I'm not talking about Earth changes in that way by an intruder body. When I'm talking about a harmonious state for our solar system, and say the Earth having 360 days, simultaneously the Moon has 30-day month, I can even show you ratios to even explain the physical movement of the Sun, the changes to the orbital periods of the other planets and so forth. But I also mentioned that the laws I have seem to also capture changes in such things as the speed of light, even related to magnetic fields and what we might consider constants like the gravity constant. For me, this is a very, very universal change. This is throughout the system. This is not about disruptions.
So it's not localized here.
It's not localized. It's a kind of an absolute change, and it is something very hard. You're getting into the realms of some very deep metaphysics. You may even go into various Gnostic systems regarding fundamental changes to the creation of various light realms, step by step in sequence, and how certain principles were activated to create states of disorder in lower realms. I would say that you'd have to go into that kind of line of thought to maybe explain what it was that disrupted our universe in total to give it this new configuration. It still has harmony, but it is a lot more complex than before. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I suppose I'll just pick up where I left off regarding astrology then, because with regards to this particular topic. All
right, I'm just going to throw in my little thing with relationship to your astrology. When in astrology, I mean, if you've studied it, there are trines where everything is in harmony and balance. And so if the universe is in harmony, I would think we would experience like the golden age where things were. But that's not what we're experiencing now. Okay, so now I'm going to give it back to you.
Yeah, this is the thing about what I said regarding astrology. There's really two aspects. You can either look at it in terms of how it affects the rise and fall of civilizations, like you say, the various different ages, or even specific human behavior. I know you can do charts for people depending on when they're born and so forth. But I was looking at natural disasters and specifically earthquakes. And one of the things I would say regarding this entire topic is that in looking at it, I did, again, follow some of the initial works of Bruce Cathy, but I did correct a few errors that I think he made in this modelling of it. And in doing so, you realise that earthquakes are high-precision events that can be forecast to extreme accuracy. And you even have the ability to manipulate these destructive forces. And that various military organisations have, in fact, covertly developed this technology. And so, essentially, they thoroughly are on board with astrology, although they never admit it, if you will. But when I was looking then at earthquakes, and you mentioned about the different systems of astrology, and I know that a lot of people look to earthquakes and they think they may be caused by conjunctions. And yes, that's true. But realistically, most people look at a top-down view of the solar system and then think about conjunctions in that way. Earthquakes are three-dimensional, and the vast majority of earthquakes essentially are triggered by the three-dimensional positioning of various bodies relative to one another. And so you have to look at it in 3 dimensions and not 2. And, the ancients referred to this physics as the music of the spheres. All of the planets, if you will, are projecting forth their energetic frequencies, whatever spectrum you want to talk about. Well, that's an entirely different topic. But they are giving forth their sounds. And each planet receives all of the signatures of the others, they rain down upon them. And it is a very complex movement in this sense. So just by the planets moving around in space, they're not just lumps of matter stuff flying blindly, but they are very energetic in projecting their frequencies. And one of the key things, and this is the key to understanding earthquakes, is they are triggered by resonance. And resonance is something that we can look at from material science. This is something scientists are very familiar with. Just to give the listeners an indication, because a lot of people will have probably heard the analogy about an opera singer smashing glass when she gets her voice to the right pitch or whatever, the right frequency. Well, if you've got, say, a physical object of certain dimensions, and it is impinged upon by an energetic waveform, say a sound or whatever, which has got a certain wavelength. As we model these, they're like a sinusoidal wavy pattern. It's peak to peak or trough to trough, right? The wavelength is between peak to peak or trough to trough. If the incoming waveform is of a certain frequency with a certain wavelength, and the wavelength fits into the dimensions of the target object that it hits a whole number of times, then it causes an internal reflection of that wave inside the object, which takes up a frozen, what we call a standing wave pattern. And the target object then goes into a state of agitation. It starts to physically shake. If the power of the incoming wave is great enough, it will cause that object to physically fail, catastrophically break apart and shatter. And this is the kind of destructive effect we get from resonance. Now, when you look at earthquakes, right, if you wanted to model an earthquake correctly, and I'll give you a critical example here, a very, very well-known earthquake on record that proves the point that resonance is a part of this. And this is the Japanese earthquake that occurred, the 9.0, which occurred on March the 11th, 2011, right? It's a very prominent one. And the thing about earthquakes when we model them is we've got precise sensors all over the Earth, and the minute the event occurs, they all start, the big graph starts going in the needle, so to speak. We can, with high precision, register precisely when they occur. And we also know, again, we can triangulate and work out the epicenters, very precise. If you are trying to work out or model how the positions of the other celestial bodies relative to the Earth trigger an earthquake, you've got to do it in 3 dimensions. There's free computer software on the internet to allow this. But what you're doing is this. Let's say we're evaluating the Japanese earthquake. It occurred March the 11th, right, 2011. 5 hours, 46 minutes, 24 seconds universal time. And we've got the location 38.322 degrees north, 142.369 degrees east. Straight out of the USGS survey, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Because we've got that precise time, we put that in an astronomy package, and we can work out the relative positions of the sun, the moon, and the other bodies. What we're looking for is this. We're looking for two things. We're looking for what is declination, that is the... essentially, we're looking for, just as I've given you the on-the-ground coordinates of the epicenter, we're looking for the on-the-ground coordinates of a celestial body. So it's like, let's say we're considering the sun. At that precise universal time, if we draw a straight line from the center of the Earth to the center of the sun, that line will pierce through the surface of the Earth and give us on-the-ground longitude and latitude, yes? The celestial things we're looking at are declination and Greenwich hour angle, right? They give us essentially longitude and latitude that we can model on the surface of the Earth, right? So for the Japanese earthquake then, if we work out the on-the-ground position of, say, the sun, it is at 3.8660 degrees south, and its longitude is about 95.942 degrees east. There is if anybody's interested in just looking at this, I have a YouTube channel called Light Descent. That's one word, Light Descent. And I do a video called Earthquake Prediction, and it does give you visuals on this and reproduces the numbers. So if you wanted to look at that further on, you can do. But basically, we've got the on-the-ground coordinates for the epicenter of the earthquake, and the on-the-ground coordinates, latitude, longitude, for the sun ground position, if you will, yes? Using advanced astronomical models. In this case, it's called the VSOP 87D celestial model, yes? And we use an Earth ellipsoid.
That's like a real sciencey
no.
model. So it's not... And the reason I'm asking it, it's not just Keith making this up. It's like this is real science, and you're just kind of reporting it.
What
okay,
I'm
just checking.
What I'm basically saying is that we use the most advanced models that the scientists have got for modeling the Earth. It's an Earth ellipsoid model developed in 1984, and it's called the the World Geodetic System, which is WGS 84, which is the ellipsoid model of the Earth, developed there, very accurate. We also use a very accurate model, I think it's the best on the market, if you will, for modelling the positions of the planets. It's the VSOP 87D model. So we can use that celestial model to work out where the sun is, and we've got the USGS, say, the authority here, cited their databases for the longitude, latitude of the epicenter of the earthquake, yes? So basically I'm using these systems, using the data of other people. I'm not manipulating it in any way. I'm just evaluating it, okay? Mm-hmm. So no one could accuse me of, making up the numbers here, but I will tell you exactly the point I'm getting at is this. Remember I said to you, resonance is triggered when you have the wavelength of an incoming wave hit a target object and it fits in a whole number of times, and it can cause destructive effects. If we work out the arc length over the surface of the ellipsoid Earth from the epicenter of the earthquake to the sun ground position, we work it out in feet. It's quite a long number to read out, but it's about 21,913,554 feet or so. Well, that value right there is practically dead on 1/6 of the Earth's equatorial circumference. And when I say practically dead on, I'm talking about error rates here of about 300 feet, right? In other words, because the Earth is moving on its axis, the Earth's movement is the biggest it's the biggest movement here. The epicenter, the location where the earthquake is striking, yes? The ground position of the sun is going to be moving dynamically across the Earth from moment to moment. And for every second that passes, it sweeps out about 1,500 feet, right? So you can see here the movement, right, of the Earth. And when you achieve this precise value between the separation of the epicenter, what becomes the epicenter that is, and where the sun is, of 1/6 the equatorial circumference, bang, that's when the earthquake is triggered, right? In other words, the implication is the Earth has been struck, if you will, by an energetic waveform that fits into the planet a whole number of times. You can also show that the ground position of the moon is related also to the epicenter, and this is via a ratio of 13/5, right, linking into the other ratio. So you end up with a kind of a three-dimensional targeting of a point on the Earth. It becomes the epicenter of an earthquake when the celestial bodies move into position very, very slowly in their orbits, and then the Earth, the biggest movement, rotating on its axis, it moves into position, and a certain point on the Earth becomes active. And this is where the earthquake strikes. And I found that it is a high-precision science. Now, if we actually look at earthquakes, just to give you an indication here.
Well,
right,
let me interject a question.
Yeah.
So, based on what you're saying, and I'm getting a little confused, is that it almost sounds like there should be an earthquake every single second of every single day as it's moving over. So what is triggering that hotspot, or the activity point on the Earth? Is it the way that the sun and the moon are in relationship to each other? Or is it because there's some kind of something going on the Earth in that point where the sun's striking it that is actually, kind of like a hotspot on the Earth that is triggering it? I kind of lost that point.
Yeah, you just hit the nail on the head, because that's what I was just coming on to.
Oh, okay.
Every year we have about 1.5 million earthquakes, right? So we get about 4,000 every day, but the vast majority of them on the Richter scale are about 2 to 2.9, right? About 2 to 3, so to speak, and they're about 1.3 million. So of that 1.5 million, 1.3, we don't even feel them practically. As you get higher up on the scale, between 3 and 4, it's about 130,000, still very much unfelt, most part. Between 4 and 5 is about 13,000. And between 5 and 6, about 1,300, right? Now, the Japanese one, about 9.0, usually get about 1 or 2 earthquakes round about that level a year, right? The higher the magnitude, the more rare it is. And what you look at when we're looking at all the planets orbiting the sun and their positions, say, relative to the Earth, right? The dynamic motions of them all tell me that earthquakes, right, are occurring at a low level, almost like background noise, because most of the configurations of the planets ordinarily are unremarkable, you might say. But when you get certain special patterns, right, of extreme significance, then you get very high magnitude earthquakes. And I think the patterns of extreme significance are obviously quite rare to get the really high ones, right? So what I looked at here, and again, I could even give another example, just very briefly. There was a Chile earthquake, 2010, February the 27th, just a couple of years ago. Again, we know the precise universal time, and this was an 8.8 earthquake, massive. I think it was the largest one that year. And again, this one involved the Sun and Jupiter. If you take the exact universal time of the earthquake, you get the epicenter point of the earthquake, we've got the coordinates for, and you get the ground position of the Sun and the ground position of Jupiter, right? If you connect up the epicenter to each of these ground positions, the arc length over the ellipsoid Earth is identical. The error rate's less than 4,000 feet difference, and both these arc lengths are about 9,050 miles, and yet they're both practically the same length, to just a slight margin of error. And these are the kinds of things which, again, it's a harmonious relationship. And I think this is what triggered that particular earthquake. So we get these kinds of relationships, and they're very subtle. They're even quite novel, because the planets are always, going in different combinations and so forth. But they are earthquakes that are extreme magnitude earthquakes. They can be forecast with exceptional accuracy, and I would say that even years in advance. We are looking for the earthquakes that stand out from the background noise, though, which occurred every day, if you will.
I'm just surprised that some entrepreneurial astrologer has not taken your work or the work of, Bruce Cathy, and started writing predictions of earthquakes. It just kind of surprises me, because I think, everything you're talking about, when I kind of put on my astrology brain, falls into the purview, other than the math part, of what they look at in a general sense of the word. So I'm surprised more people, in that field have not kind of looked at it deeper.
For me, when I look at this area, I would say that, and in my book, I have a special chapter at the end about earthquake prediction and tell you exactly what you need to do in terms of developing the software and what you need to look at. Now, this has already been done. The software that you've just talked about, the model, it's already been done in secret. The military's done it. And I'm going to give you an example, and this is absolutely rock solid. If you want to talk about can people predict earthquakes well in advance, well, there was an earthquake, right? And this earthquake occurred in Mexico, and it was to the south of Mexico City, and the date is the 20th of March 2012, right? And what was first registered at that location, right, was an earthquake, and it occurred at 2 minutes 48 seconds past 12 noon on March the 20th, 2012, and it was first registered as a 7.9 earthquake, right? Quite a large one. Now, what you might
wonder if the people in Mexico were freaking out.
Well, here's the thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Here's the thing. Months prior to this, and this is all in the national newspapers, you can check it out. There are articles on the internet that Mexico was conducting an earthquake preparedness drill, right? And it turns out it was in the very place, right, on the very day when this real earthquake occurred. And they were sending out leaflets, and I'm just looking at one right now. It says simulacro. It's all in foreign, and it literally says it says mega simulacro, mega simulation, 20th of March 2012. This leaflet was produced, right, well before the event in question, and the simulation date is given right there, 20th of March, and the hour 12 noon, right, and they're simulating. It says it right on the leaflet. A 7.9 earthquake. So they're getting everybody prepared for a simulation of a 7.9 earthquake months in advance in this very area just south of Mexico City, right? And then 2 minutes 48 seconds past 12 noon on the very day in question, a real 7.9 earthquake occurs. It was literally right there. They downgraded it just afterwards to a 7.6, I think, but the initial report's 7.9, right? Now, if people are saying, we can't predict earthquakes, come on, of course they can. They were warned an earthquake was going to occur, because you can forecast this. They were warned, and somebody will have told the Mexican people, the authorities there, to get ready for an earthquake prediction. They may not have even told them that it was really going to happen. There'll be a certain level of need to know on this. But they were told. And it just goes to show you that we could get examples here where there seems to be advanced knowledge that they're going to occur. The powers that be, if you will. And the reason why we can be sure of this, in fact, is because you can artificially trigger earthquakes. And this has to do with tapping into the celestial mechanism itself. And this is where we really get an explanation for how astrology works. You see...
But are you going to go into the whole HARP thing? Because there are so many people that think that HARP has to do, or is the cause of a number of earthquakes and, disruptions to the planet's surface these days.
Well, the way it seems to work for earthquakes is the devices themselves that you might use to trigger them, they basically stimulate or destabilize a certain point on the Earth, which itself is vulnerable at that moment. The power of the device itself isn't enough to trigger the event. It can only stimulate a weakened situation. And I'll explain what I mean by this. You see, when it comes to astrology, right, I had to basically ask myself the question, if the positions or arrangements of the moon, the sun, and the other planets can trigger an earthquake on the Earth, how exactly do they do it? You can't just say, well, it's a fancy pattern. How exactly is it done? And this is where I developed, and it took a few different, things and drew them together. It's almost some of the esoteric stuff, if you will, in quantum mechanics. But quite a few people, like Bruce Cathy himself, have said that our reality, as we view it, is not continuous, it is intermittent. In other words, when we talk about the movement of a person walking around, it's not that they move through space. You've got individual snapshots, if you will, of them moving frame to frame, right? And they are connected via extension to a sort of ultimate frame of reference, where you get form from formlessness. You have an emergence of form, it withdraws into formlessness. Emergence of form, but displaced, withdraws into formlessness. And I realize that's a hard thing to, get across, but basically the point is this. If you could manifest at a certain point, withdraw into this zero quantum potential, and you just emerged at a greater distance than normal, in inverted commas, people would say that's like teleportation, if you will. Yes? And when I was looking at with respect to the whole problem here of what is an earthquake, my answer is this. It is the localized withdrawal of a measure of matter just under the surface of one celestial body into a kind of quantum potential. And simultaneously, as it is withdrawing, you have the same measure of matter emerging and forcing its way into a region of space just underneath the surface of another celestial body. And this may take several seconds or 30 seconds or whatever. The duration of the earthquake is, by definition, this physical destabilization of that region, because matter is withdrawing from it to be transported to another body, or it is emerging. So you're always going to have a pairing. And I regard the entire solar system, all the planets, all the celestial bodies, moons, the sun, they're all dynamically exchanging matter between themselves at any given moment. And this explains why you have this background noise of a lot of earthquakes, if you will, 1.3 million low-level ones that we can hardly feel. You've got all the configurations of the planets and the celestial bodies, and they're dynamically transferring matter, and they're all responsible for giving each other earthquakes, if you will. And it's a balance mechanism. It's like safety valves transferring matter around to keep the system in equilibrium. But when the planets arrange themselves in certain rare combinations, that's when we get these very powerful earthquakes. And I would concede ultimately, when we get extremely accurate conjunctions, that's when we get entire planets shaking and some of the end of age scenarios. I'll come into that much later on, hopefully, in the interview. But just to tell you that that's where I believe an earthquake is. It is the transference of matter between celestial bodies when certain special patterns are achieved. Now, when it comes to weapons, you mentioned HARP. You could also talk about nuclear weapons because they do the same thing. The entire evaluation that I've just given you about earthquakes, that is, looking at an earthquake database, when the earthquake occurred precisely, and where its epicenter was. If you were to just substitute earthquake epicenter for location of a nuclear test when it went off, and you have the precise time as to when it went off for that rather than when the earthquake occurred, right? The precise time of the nuclear detonation, you can actually find that nuclear weapons tests are all related to the positions of the moon, the sun, the other celestial bodies, just like with earthquakes. Now, what I'm saying is...
Wait a minute. Say that again or rephrase that because I'm not sure I heard that correct.
Okay. Basically, what I've just said is that if you have earthquakes, right, we know where the epicenter is. We record it from our sensors. We record the exact location, longitude, latitude, and we also record the exact time, down to the nearest second that it occurs. And if you evaluate high magnitude earthquakes, you will find that there are arc length measures over the surface of the Earth connecting up the ground positions of various celestial bodies to the epicenter points, and they have a musical signature implying resonance, yes?
Correct.
Well, all I'm saying is, if instead of looking at earthquakes, you look at the historical databases we have for nuclear weapons tests, and instead of using the epicenter location of an earthquake, you put the longitude, latitude location of a known nuclear weapons test. Mm-hmm. And you then look at when the device was triggered, precise universal time down to the nearest second. If you do that, you will find that nuclear weapons have the same energetic musical signatures as earthquakes. In other words, they too are triggered when there is a special combination, a favorable combination, right, of celestial bodies nearby, like using the sun or the moon. And I did an analysis of this. This is in my book. I did about 15 or 16 different nuclear weapons tests. And you can demonstrate that the key ratios link up the ground positions of the tests, or in the case of, say, wartime usage, you can look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can find basic ratios like 3/2, 8/3, 11/7, linking up various arc lengths, right, to either the surface of the Earth, the dimensions of the Earth, or to one another. And again, they indicate that nuclear weapons themselves are triggered when there is a favorable celestial configuration. So what a nuclear weapon is doing is this. You've got the internal components of the device. You've got, say, your plutonium. You implode the plutonium core with shaped charges to reach a sort of critical mass, right? An exponential release of energy, if you will. But that action, in effect, does not cause your nuclear explosion. If you were to just do that action at any random point on the Earth, right, at any random time, you'd have a minimal explosion from your shaped charges, lots of radioactive contamination, but you'd have no massive explosion. You've actually got to time the explosion, time the devices, deliver them to a certain target site, and trigger them with split-second timing, just like with earthquakes, in order to create an interaction between your device and this matter transfer, beam, so to speak. I think that's maybe a bad word, but that connection there between different celestial bodies, just like you're tapping in to an energy stream, right, with your nuclear reaction, you're tapping into it to draw off the energy, which then destroys your nuclear weapon to cause your outward explosion. The device doesn't have the power inherent to itself to cause the explosion. It basically is destroyed by external energy between celestial bodies. And this means even the delivery of nuclear weapons is a high precision thing. I mean, for example,
it sounds like, let me just ask this question, but it sounds like the government, I mean, based on what you were saying before and their ability to predict earthquakes, that they're taking that into consideration in the locating where they're going to, we'll use Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, they could have, all right, I'm not a big war buff person, but why didn't they use them in Germany? Why did they wait and use them there? But maybe based on what you're saying, that was the appropriate place to get the maximum potential for it?
Well, as far as Germany goes, the war in Europe was over too soon. But from what I gather, the US did want to keep the war going a bit longer in order to use these devices against Japan. I mean, the position of the emperor was already secured. There was no problem with that angle. For those that know the history, they'll know what I'm talking about. They were all willing to surrender, but the US primarily dragged it on. There's even memos in World War I referring to Wilson dragging on World War I specifically in order to cause maximum, shall we say, socio-political change in the US, dragging the war on. So wars are very criminal businesses, and the war was dragged on in order to be able to use these devices against Japan when there was absolutely no need whatsoever. But the target sites were very carefully chosen, and they had to energetically, if you will, work. And just to give you an example, I mean, over Hiroshima, it was I think the pilot's name was, what's his name now? Tibbets, I think his name is. He was basically flying, it was a B-29 bomber, and when he was on the run, he will have been told to get to a certain height, be travelling at a certain speed, and release the bomb at a very precise time. And it was in the air for 43 seconds. And then the minute it's dropped, quickly get out of the way, bank off. Because for every second that bomb is falling through the air, the Earth is rotating on its axis. The sun ground position is moving dynamically over the surface of the ellipsoid Earth. And when that device is triggered, the arc length connecting up the device's position just above the ground at Hiroshima and where the sun was, that arc length there was energetically viable. And you can even show linkages to that arc length, how it relates to other arc lengths used on other tests. And it indicates the high precision required to actually initiate, to trigger a nuclear weapon. If you were talking about an ICBM fired from a silo, you can't just willfully fire, the missile and travel at its best speed, if you will, to its target, say, 6,000 miles away. What you've got to do is very carefully alter its trajectory to synchronize its arrival just at its target site, just above it, right, at a certain latitude and longitude, relative to a certain combination of celestial bodies, or just the sun maybe, and have it activated right when certain arc lengths are established. It's high precision stuff in order to initiate the weapon. There's explosion. These are not like conventional weapons where you can just trigger them wherever you like and whenever you like. You've got to synchronize their activation in both space and time in order to trigger the device, internally implode it, get your chain reaction, but do that precisely to take advantage of certain celestial forces which harmonically converge, if you will, right on the target of where your device is upon activation. It's quite a difficult concept to get across, and I realize a lot of people might be thinking, no, this can't be right. I've done quite a good evaluation of it.
Hey, Keith, we need to go to a break. Actually, we're running a little late, but this has been so interesting, so I didn't want to stop you, but we do need to go. They're sending me nastiograms. So,
okay.
So let's take a quick break, and I'm here talking to Keith Hunter about his book, The Lost Age of High Knowledge. His webpage is www.ancient-world-mysteries.com, and we'll be back with Keith after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com. It can be heard every Thursday evening live on the Inception Radio Network from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget, you can listen to all of our archives on the Just Energy Radio webpage, www.justenergyradio.com. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep you informed of who's coming up on the show. If you're a YouTube person, all of our, or at least the last 2 years of shows are archived on YouTube, and that is the Just Energy Radio YouTube channel. So we've been talking to Keith Hunter about his book, The Lost Secrets of the Ancients. His webpage is www.ancientworldmysteries.com. Keith, before we went to break, you were talking about the explosive power of nuclear weapons and planetary alignments. And you earlier, I'm going to kind of take it in a slightly different area. We briefly mentioned HAARP. And there are a lot of people that have come out and made the claim or speculated that the earthquake in Southeast Asia was actually based on the government using HAARP to set off that tsunami. Have you looked into that at all?
Well, one of the things regarding earthquakes, and again, based upon just what I've said about nuclear weapons, is this. You could be dealing with a situation where an entirely natural event is up and coming, and if you will, the powers that be have got very advanced knowledge about the modelling. I would imagine they've got the software nailed, if you will, so they may well be able to forecast entirely natural high-yield events, and they may even make moves, if you will, which indicate foreknowledge, like moving ships out of the area or whatever. They may make moves like that, which may well reveal a kind of an awareness that it is going to come, and advanced knowledge. So it could be that you're dealing with something like that. But at the same time, you could also be dealing with a situation where somebody has artificially stimulated the earthquake. And if you will, the signatures, the musical signatures between artificial earthquakes and natural earthquakes are very, very similar. It's very difficult. I mean, I certainly would not be able to tell you, based purely on the signatures, whether it was artificial or natural. It could very, very well have been natural, but it might also have been artificial. I think some of the evidence people are pointing towards is of the type that Japan, I think, was storing some kind of nuclear fuel there, and they were maybe helping the Iranians with processing, and they were also targeted with software to screw up some of the software in the plant itself, so they would not be able to respond to a disaster if it came, and that occurred just prior to it. It could well be, because I know there's some researchers out there that are pointing towards it being artificial. They may well be right. That may well have been artificially created, but again, even artificially created, it was bound by the positions of essentially the celestial spheres, primarily the sun and the moon in this case. They would have had to have made use of that resonant signature in order to create the event. So again, I've only looked at the mainly the signature. I have not really looked in depth into the full politics behind it, but it could very well.
Yeah, I didn't really care about the politics part. I think it would just be interesting, with what we're talking about, to look at the event that happened, the magnitude of the earthquake, or just the vastness of that disaster. And based on what you're saying, look at the planetary alignments to see if there was a major alignment going on, if it was minor, and if there was help in making it happen. Can you tell? Maybe that's the better question. Can you tell, based on planetary alignment, the potential vastness of an event, an earthquake event?
Well, just let me clarify that point. The vast majority of earthquakes, as I've said, do not involve planetary alignments. We are looking at the Earth as the surface of the ellipsoid Earth as the template. We're looking at this in 3 dimensions, and we are looking at arc lengths separating the epicenter points to the ground positions, if you like, of various bodies mapped onto the surface of the Earth. So if you were to talk about an actual alignment with the Earth triggering an earthquake, you'd have to have the ground positions of 2 different bodies practically dead on top of one another, with maybe only 1,000 feet of error on the surface of the Earth. And they then might have an energetic link to, say, an earthquake that occurred somewhere. So the vast majority of earthquakes out there do not involve planetary alignments. If you're talking about planetary alignments, causing massive effects to the Earth, I would say you're now into the realms of these very special alignments that trigger end-of-age scenarios. Planetary alignments generally don't trigger earthquakes. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I will say this much, just to move on to a little associated topic before we get back to maybe exploring those end-of-age scenarios. One of the other things, and again, my book, The Lost Age of High Knowledge, looks at megalithic structures, right? Because what I also find when I look at certain structures like Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid, they too have a very special global positioning to them, which seems to tie in to the same science as this resonance and this music of the spheres. And there's some brilliant explanations of, say, for example, why Stonehenge was built where it was, and also why the Great Pyramid was built where it was. And again, there's a certain numerology tied into this, but it also seems to, reveal to us that these structures had an energetic significance. I mean, when we look at, say, the Great Pyramid, I think people out there may be familiar with the work of, say, Christopher Dunn, and he wrote a book called The Giza Power Plant.
We've had Christopher on the show several times. So
yeah, he's looked at the the engineering of the pyramid itself, and he's looked at the machine tool aspect, the whole thing there, and come up with a case that it was an energetic device that was set into motion with some kind of gears, the grand gallery section, that was getting it to vibrate to draw seismic energy. This is the general point. What I've actually done is look at the global positioning of the Great Pyramid, and I find that there's this remarkable ratio which seems to define its latitude. Now, most people will be familiar with the fact that it's just under 30 degrees north. It's precisely 29 degrees, 58 minutes, and 51 seconds of arc north. That's 29 degrees, 58 minutes, 51 north. And it turns out, and again, this just goes to show you the significance of ratios. If you're going to build a structure which is going to tap into the Earth's energy, you need to build it to certain dimensions, right, which allows for a resonant interaction with the Earth. And you also need to build it at certain locations, which, again, are significant relative to the whole Earth. If you look at the circumference of the Earth at the latitude of the Great Pyramid, as I've just given, and that little small circle circumference, which is parallel to the equatorial circumference, yes? That small circle circumference, if you divide that value by the arc length value from the equator right up to the latitude of just under 30 degrees, yeah? The ratio between them is practically dead on 10 times the ratio of change for the Earth's year from 360 days to 365 and a quarter or so. The value you get is 10.14561622, right? So that's the rich. In other words, when we talk about the Earth increasing its days per year, here you've somehow got this ratio, which is 10 times the change for the Earth year, seems to have defined why they placed it at that latitude. And the margin of error on that ratio is something like 50 feet. I mean, you see, in the polar dimensions of our Earth, right, the circumference of the Earth, pole to pole, as an elliptical circumference, is about 131 million feet. And if you were to take the Great Pyramid and just move it slightly, 50 feet north, that ratio that you get, that coordinate, yeah, you're just increasing it, that ratio, 50 feet north, and you get a perfect ratio as to what we have as to the Earth's exacting tropical year to a 360-day ideal, multiplied by 10. It's that precise. And if you want to know why the Great Pyramid was built to the size it was built, well, its dimensions, it's 4 sides, the average side, they're just like an inch or two out when they measure them all. But it's practically 9,000 and I think it's 69.4 inches, just a touch under 756 feet, right? Well, if you take just the arc length from the equator up to the latitude of it and divide by its base dimension, you get almost dead on. It's 14,400, right? 14400, right? That's the arc length divided by the base dimension of the pyramid. And you may have heard the Great Pyramid is reputed to have had, when it was fully complete, 144,000 casing stones. Here you've got a ratio 14400 to 1, 14,400 to 1. So you can see that if Chris is right about it being tapping into the Earth, I think that it was built to the dimensions it was to have this energetic connection to the Earth itself, and it's via this kind of technology. Another thing is, as well, you can demonstrate that various covert military bases, if you will, they, built in the modern age, embody the same sorts of considerations. Have you ever heard of Pine Gap and Menwith Hill?
I have not.
Both of these are two of the largest signals intelligence facilities on the planet. They're both US owned and operated, but they're in foreign countries.
Figures.
Yeah. The Pine Gap facility is almost dead on in central Australia near Alice Springs.
Would this be like an underground base?
Oh, no, you can zoom right in on it on Google
checking.
Earth. It's one of these facilities which, to look at it, it's the big golf ball type things with the ray domes underneath, yes?
Uh-huh.
You might have seen them. It's basically an array of they've got about, I don't know, I think it's 17 or 18 of these big golf balls with the ray domes. It's a massive rectangular type building complex at Pine Gap. It's out in the middle of a desert. It's supposed to be there to help with radar, advanced warning, and also satellites and signals intelligence and monitoring everything going, all electronic communications. And it is linked up to the Menwith Hill site, which is a facility almost identical to Pine Gap. Massive rectangular building, big golf ball type things, the ray domes. And again, it's probably the biggest facility in Europe, definitely, for doing this, right? But these two sites here are linked together via the Earth, and they were very carefully set up. Menwith Hill was built in the 1950s, and the Pine Gap one was built in the 1960s. And what they did was this: once they'd established Menwith Hill, they went to the Australian government and they said, we'd like to build some base, in your country. And they said, right, we've got a specific place that we want to build this base on. Very, very specific. And it was some land owned by somebody, and I believe they kind of forced him into some sale. Fire sale price. I think he got completely screwed out in it financially. But they wanted this particular piece of land. And there's a reason why. You see, they wanted a certain latitude south of the equator. And I'll even tell you again, it's almost with this magic number, so to speak. Again, we can use our advanced Earth ellipsoid model, the WGS model. The arc length, right, from the equator to the position of this Pine Gap site, right, the actual coordinate south is 23 degrees 48 minutes 3.6 seconds of arc south. That arc length right there, yes, if you divide it by that unit of measure I first mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, 6,000 feet, right? If you divide it by 6,000 feet, you'll get a value of 1,440, 1440 of that sequence. And remember, our units of measure are not arbitrary. There's an energetic significance in placing this at that latitude. But the next bit is really interesting. If you've worked out the latitude you want it placed at, you could basically cut Australia in half and say, well, where on that line do we want it? Well, they wanted to link this up to Menwith Hill via the Earth itself. And if you go to the coordinates of both of them, and you use a great circle calculator to work out the arc length from the centre of Menwith Hill complex to the centre of Pine Gap over the ellipsoid Earth, right? That arc length is 3/8 with respect to the Earth's equatorial circumference. In other words, the equator of the Earth, if we divide it by 8 and multiply by 3, that is the very value for the arc length connecting up these sites. So remember I was talking about the Japanese earthquake, how we had an energetic wave hit the Earth, fits into the Earth's equator 6 times, yes, it's a 1-to-6 ratio. Here you've got energetic structures, structures built, and they are done so to achieve certain ratios that you would again expect are allowing them to tap into certain Earth energies via resonance to achieve certain effects. So you can see that there's a network of these bases built, and they're very carefully sited. There's even a link to that Utah facility, this new NSA monitoring system in Utah that they're building at the moment, or I think they're expanding it or something. But the location for that site right there, you can even link that in. You can even link in Buckley Air Force Base. These are all sites, if you will, that are, said to be part of this echelon matrix of, sites for monitoring signals intelligence and, grabbing even out of thin air, if you will, satellite phone calls, the whole works. But more than that, they also seem to be built where they are, and I would imagine that there are deep levels, underground levels to these facilities where they are engaged in some very exotic experiments which are tied in to some of the work on nuclear weapons, triggering earthquakes. I'll bet that there's some very highly classified work goes on at these places, which is a lot deeper than just signals intelligence.
I'm shocked. No. Oop. Are you still there?
Yes, yep, still here.
It just got quiet and it was like...
I was just taking a drink there.
I just think it's interesting. You're bringing up these bases and this government influence. What I think is really fascinating is that the bases that you're talking about were built in the early 50s. And it just seems like there has been, and I'm just going to bring in a weird, allegory, a lot of activity and kind of like a lot of reemergence of ancient knowledge and ancient understanding of ourselves and the universe kind of since, Roswell. And, that whole beginning of the modern UFO era. And do you think, all right, I'm just going to go out on a limb here. Do you think there's any connection? Do you believe in extraterrestrials? And do you think that there has been extraterrestrial contact with
absolutely.
Our government?
There's no doubt in my mind. I would even say that the extraterrestrials have essentially always been with us. I think if you read some of the works from ancient times, even the Bible, you can very much interpret certain things in the Bible to imply extraterrestrial contact. I think that, for example, is it Moses seeing the burning bush or whatever,
That's my favorite.
You could very well, I mean, I know we've seen Charlton Heston, and the Ten Commandments doing the thing on the mountain, but the way in which that is described, as other people said, he says to Moses, go to a certain place, don't get too close, otherwise my power will burn you, that kind of thing. I mean, this again, we've often heard reports of craft getting near to people, and they've suffered doses of radioactive, contamination, the radioactive levels which have been dangerous, causing the hair to fall out. We've had things like that. And if I might tie in another little thing, I think this is a reference, if I've got the article right, this was referring to George Adamski. He was an early contactee from the 50s. And interestingly enough, there was a reference made. It was told something to the effect of the ETs did not like us setting off nuclear weapons because it affected their world. And this is just one of those little extra pieces to the puzzle, because remember I said to you about earthquakes, it's a pairing system. And if you have an earthquake occur at the Earth, on the Earth, matter say withdrawing, it's going to simultaneously emerge somewhere else causing an earthquake on another celestial body. And I'm not even going to say this is restricted to our solar system. And again, when you do a nuclear test, remember, you're tapping into the same mechanism as with earthquakes. So if you do a nuclear test, you could trigger an earthquake on another celestial body. The physics does seem to allow for this. In fact, I think that's exactly what goes on. When you hear about other people who've talked about nuclear weapons tests, they actually say that, they use terms like it rips a hole in space-time. Well, I did an evaluation of a nuclear weapon test called Canakin. This was the highest yield underground test ever conducted by the US. It was on one of the Aleutian Islands, and it was in 1971, 6th of November, 2200 hours. And when it went off, it registered a signature of an earthquake about 6.5, right? Basically, a 5 megaton device will give you a 6.5 earthquake, yes? Mm-hmm. But what was also interesting was that 2 days later, exactly the same coordinates, there was registered a 4.9 earthquake, right? And remember I said to you about our reality being intermittent, right? In other words, if you were to be pulsating in your manifestation at a certain rate and you withdrew into the quantum potential, you could have a big massive step and then emerge somewhere else. It would appear as if it's teleportation, instantaneous, but that's just a shift in position. You can also alter dramatically the frequency which you're pulsating at. So you have the next manifestation occur well into the future. In other words, that would be time travel. And I think that what happened with that explosion, the initial one, was that the vast majority of the explosion occurred, if you will, right at the same coordinates. But a fraction of that explosion was literally transmitted into the future and manifested as an earthquake some 2 days later. I think that the whole issue of this kind of technology, it delves into the manipulation of matter, it delves into time travel, and have you ever heard of the Philadelphia experiment?
I was just going to ask you about that, if there was a parallel to that. So,
well, there is indeed. This is something that Bruce Cathy looked at in one of his books, and I did my own evaluation of it, and I used his coordinates. But the way I evaluate things is different to his, so I'm at least glad that it's his data because, again, no one can accuse me of manipulating it. One of the intriguing aspects of the Philadelphia experiment, and for those people that have never heard of it, I'll at least briefly recap. It's an experiment that is alleged, if you will, to have occurred in 1943 during the Second World War. And as you can imagine, lots of scientists were engaged in all kinds of projects to help the war effort. And one of the things that was being looked at was being able to basically confound enemy radar, right? Now, if somebody's got a radar system and they are sweeping an area and you've got some vehicle in or a ship or a plane or whatever, right? You obviously, it's going to bounce off your ship or plane and come back to sender, and they're going to know where you are. So one of the things that they were looking at, the scientists, was bathing in some way, and they were looking at primarily seagoing vessels, getting some equipment on the seagoing vessel to bathe it in a bubble of some kind of electrical field or magnetic field. And the aim of the game was to confound the radar signals. Either they would come into the bubble, be absorbed or reflected at odd angles or refracted, but basically they wouldn't go back to sender, so you wouldn't know they were there. That was what they were looking at. And the whole thing came out much later on, I think it was in the 50s sometime, because there was a man, his name was Dr. Jessup, and he wrote a book about UFOs, and he was talking about Einstein's unified field theory and some of the implications of that. And he put forward this theory, at least in a partial form, in 1927, and then he withdrew it. And he was a bit worried, Einstein, because he was basically thinking that, with all the wars going off, with the state of, humanity at present, it seems that the more scientific knowledge you put out there, the more it's going to be used for destructive purposes. And so he kind of withdrew it. Now, this guy, Jessup, he wrote, as I say, a book. It was The Case for the UFO. And he, again, He's a qualified doctor. He's in lots of science. Really credible person, you know. And it was a very good case. And he was talking about Einstein's unified field theory. And the story goes, somebody who was, you know, present at one of his presentations, he basically had heard about this. He was apparently a witness in a ship, right, which was just slightly far away from another ship which was involved in this radar experiment, right? The destroyer, I believe it was the Eldridge, and this was a ship that had all this equipment on 1943, and they had a crew on the ship. I think it was just a skeleton crew, and they went out for a certain trial. They switched on all their magnetic field generators, right? And this guy, whose name was Carl Sayende, he was in a ship which was nearby, an observer ship. And he reportedly saw the whole thing of what happened when they switched on the field. And he was in one of the lectures that Jessup was giving. And so he heard Jessup speak about the unified field equation. And from his knowledge, he thought the unified field equation was used as part of this Philadelphia experiment. And what he witnessed, he wrote in a series of letters that he sent to Jessup, right? He sent these letters via mail to Dr. Jessup, long rambling letters, in fact. You can view them in a few publications like the Philadelphia Experiment by Charles Berlitz. And basically, what happened when the magnetic field was switched on is the entire ship literally seemed to become hazy and then disappear completely to human eyes. You could see the impression of the hull in the water. In other words, it wasn't just radar invisible, it was literally invisible to somebody looking at it, right? Now, when they did this, he initially thought, wow, amazing, miraculous, even magical. And then he turned off the field, and this is when everything seemed to go wrong. What had happened when they'd turned on this field, some of the crew later on were trying to explain, it was like they were standing on nothing. The ship was gone. They were saying everything visually was all weird and strange. When they turned the field off, some of the crew seemed to be embedded in bulkheads and were dead instantly. Other crew never reappeared with the ship. Right? There were all kinds of things that went wrong with it. Some of them seemed to disappear to other dimensions, if you will. You know, I was talking about the pulsation rate of a person. Ordinarily, it's in tune with everything else. If you were to fundamentally alter that, it's like, you know how we can hear human sounds within certain ranges of hearing, yes? Mm-hmm. You go outside certain frequencies, we can't hear it. It's like with the physical manifestation of people. They had altered their frequency base, so they shifted outside our reality. They just disappeared, gone, and they didn't come back. And they were reporting all these strange effects, but what I'm kind of leading up to here is one of the weird things that was reported to have happened with respect to this ship. Whilst it was in its dock, it seemed to have some kind of effect of this field. Even after they'd done the experiments, there were after effects. And the ship is reported to have done a kind of a double teleportation. It disappeared from naval docks and appeared at another location. And the two places, right, Norfolk Naval Docks and Penn's Landing area on the Delaware River. And Bruce Cathy has the coordinates for both of these in his book. And I even went on Google Earth and was zooming in and trying to get the precise locations of them and everything and where they were. And I did an analysis of the arc length separating these 2 points and also even the latitude of one of these arc lengths. That is the latitude of the Penn's Landing area, because interestingly enough there was a College of Science right on the same latitude, and this is a connection Cathy makes. He thinks that they've chosen this certain latitude, just like the Great Pyramids built at a certain latitude, because there are energetic effects they want to explore there, and they need to be a certain arc length distance from the equator to achieve these effects. It's almost via a resonance effect in respect to the Earth. And I looked at this pure latitude arc, And if you read out the sequence in feet, right, it's something like, what is it now? 14,511,909 feet. Something along those lines. I always use feet, I have to say, because I go for the high precision values, so I don't use miles or anything. I always use feet. But if you get that value in feet, and remember the Sumerian system uses 6 as a basic multiplier, well, if you take that and keep on successively dividing by 6, you find that you are not in a random progression of numbers, and you end up going all the way back to 1.44000027. That's, very accurately you find yourself in this same sequence of numbers. And this is why arc lengths connecting up various events to locations on the Earth, like the ground position of a celestial body to an epicenter or a nuclear location for a test site, you find these arc lengths are of numeric sequences which, although they might appear to be, dare I say, random, when you use basic multipliers, you find that they are a part of basic series of progressions of imperial measures of distance units. They're not random at all. So what Cathy did then, he got the coordinates for these 2 locations that this ship was apparently alleged to have disappeared at, reappeared, then disappeared and gone back to its original location. And what I found was that the arc length from the equator up to the latitude of one of these locations is very significant via that progression I've just noted. But also, the arc length separation between them, which is about some 220 miles, the exact value I get using Cathy's coordinates, right, is 1,152,082 feet. If you simply just divide that number by 8, the number 8, you get 144,010.
So you're back to that 144 number.
Yeah. I realise that it's one of these strange numbers which appears to pop up in so many relations. It even pops up on a pyramid in Mars. Have you ever heard of those stories? Pyramids on Mars.
Oh yeah, the face on Mars and Cydonia and
yes.
But go ahead, because that's another area that I find pretty interesting.
Here's another thing about the pyramid on Mars. I say the pyramid, you're right, it's the Cydonia region, and the face is located there. But just to the southwest, there's a group of structures like pyramids, and one is this massive 5-sided pyramid, right? Mm-hmm. And I did an evaluation of this, and the evaluation is as follows. I used the US Naval Observatory's model that we have of Mars. They have a precise equatorial radius and also a flattening measure, because Mars is a slightly squashed sphere. I used their model. I got the location for the latitude of the pyramid, and this was from a site Richard Hoagland, you might have heard of him, worked at NASA. He put it on his site, and again, doesn't know my work, he put that on all on his own. So I used the location as given for the latitude from his site and also US Naval Observatory's model, and I did a very simple ratio just to see, and here's what you get. You know, I talked about the significance of the small circle circumference of the latitude of the Great Pyramid, yes? Mm-hmm. If you take that same small circle circumference of the latitude of this 5-sided pyramid, which is actually at a latitude of 40.893 degrees north, right? You calculate using the model for Mars from the US Naval Observatory, the small circle circumference at that latitude, and divide by the equatorial circumference, right, of Mars itself, you get a value, right, and this again, this is the precise value you'll get on your calculator, is 0.719997795. Now, if you just multiply that by 2, it's practically dead on 1.44. It's 0.7199. Yeah, exactly, to the extreme accuracy right there. And again, it tells me that there's an energetic connection. They deliberately chose this latitude And the same considerations as went into the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge were right there. So you can even draw connections to facilities off-world. So you've essentially got the military forces placing bases around the world, reconstructing, if you will, the science of the ancients. They're too building them, linking them together via the earth, via basic musical ratios, just like the ancients themselves did. I mean, you might have heard of the Israeli nuclear reactor, their facility in Dimona. This is in the Negev desert. Again, it's one of these facilities that's tied into this matrix, if you will. That site is linked to the Menwith Hill site, the Signals Intelligence Facility, in the UK here, but also, interestingly enough, you can demonstrate that the arc length, right, that connects up the Negev site to the Great Pyramid, right, is a fraction of 1/100th of the elliptical circumference of the Earth. Right? So again, you can see how they use arc lengths which seem to connect up different sites and then also fit in to key dimensions of the Earth. So it was very carefully sited, that plant. It was actually built by the French for the Israelis. I think it was 1958. So again, you can see how you've got all these different sites at different locations, and they're reconstructing them. Another little example.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
You know, because you keep coming up with that 1.44 number. And when you read ancient texts, you know, and I'll just kind of very generically, I'll just throw out the Bible. You find numbers that are constantly repeating, you know, like 40 days and 40 nights, or the number 7, or the number 12. In the work that you're doing, are you finding those kind of numbers as well? Because like 14 or 1.44, you know, I have not personally seen in ancient text, but I'm just wondering if there is yet a different connection going on that I'm missing.
That number, the sequence 144, and you might have a number of zeros after it. You're right, it is in many books. You know the Mayan long count calendar you mentioned? Mm-hmm. One of the biggest cycle of it is called the Bakton, which is 144,000 days.
That's true.
And in the Bible, in Revelation, there are 144,000 people that are saved. They're grouped into 12. So there's 12,000, and you've got 12 such groups. And they're all, I think, singing a song that only they know. So it's linked into that, but it's also linked into two other things. You know the speed of light? Bruce Cathy, in his work, he measures the speed of light not in units of miles, say, per second. He uses nautical miles, and they're about 6,076 feet, yeah? He uses nautical miles, and he uses a unit of time of 8/9 of a second. And if you do that, the speed of light is about 144,000 nautical miles per 8/9 of a second. And another thing is, and this is another basic way in which that value is tied in, you know, between Mars and Jupiter, there's the asteroid belt. And this is, you know, most people regard it as an exploded planet who've at least looked at the evidence. I think the planetary theory that it was a planet that never formed is being really shot to flames, shot down in flames. It really is a planet that seems to have blown up. And the Russians that openly call this exploded planet Phaeton. And that is a very special character from myth. And I could go into the mythology about that because it is to do with planetary conjunctions triggering massive celestial changes. But for the moment, I'll just say this much. You know how I said I reconstructed the solar system and showed how you could back transform it? Well, the asteroid belt, right, is mainly a very widely scattered debris field, but the primary body within it is a dwarf planet. So it's not a jagged edge piece of rock, it's a dwarf planet, and it's called Ceres. That's Ceres. Ceres. And because this is a kind of a spheroid type object, about, I think it's 6,000 miles in diameter, you know, the theory is it was one of the moons of this exploded body, right? And when I did an evaluation of Ceres and looked at its orbital period, I thought, well, if this body blew up, then Ceres would become the primary celestial body at this kind of interval or this band from the Sun. And I did a very careful evaluation of Ceres, and I found that I could back transform its orbit using the same laws of proportion for Venus, right? There's a massive relationship between Venus and Ceres. The power combination was 32 and 3. I won't go into the technicalities, but you can see that on some of my YouTube videos. It's a bit complex to explain. But I found I could back transform Ceres' orbital period most harmoniously from its current value, which is 1,680 days. It turns out its ideal period was 1,440 days. And that is one of the most beautiful and elegant laws in my book, because it ties into Venus, right? Venus itself used to be precisely 225 days, but it's just slightly dropped to about 224.695. Venus has suffered a very slight drop in its orbital period.
So you don't think that has to do with the orbital period of the Earth shifting and now our relationship to Venus shifted?
I think they all shifted together. All the planets are governed by these laws, and if you cause a change in one planet slightly, all the laws kick in to transform all the other planets by very precise measures.
But that makes so much more sense. You know, I did a bunch of work looking at the Mayan calendar and the predictions and just looking at the mythology, you know, like, are we going to blow up? What about the dating element? You know, blah, 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 blah. And that's where I was really finding that 300, you know, plus 5 day year. And I can't remember what I was researching, but they brought up the Venus cycle. Oh, it was the sacred calendar, you know, that it was associated with Venus. And I'm like, okay, until I started reading some of the articles around, it's like, well, it's associated with Venus, but you take the orbital cycle and then you divide it by 8 and take 4 times the square root of that and add 1. And boom, see how simple that is? And I don't think that ancients would have made a system where they had to do all of this work to come out with a cycle. But it would make sense that something happened and the basic observation of it was changed. You know, like that 360 day year changing into a 365 day year. I think they were smart enough to count. I don't know. What do you think?
I would say that this change I'm talking about to the solar system, this is something I couldn't even begin to tell you how long ago. We're talking, I don't know, millions or billions of years, something, a vast length of time. I think we've suffered more recent disruptions to the orbits of planets and fluctuations in various orbital periods and distances, but they're not to do with this primary massive shift that I've really captured with these laws of proportion. But you're right, the Venus calendar stuff, I realise that today's scientists, the way we look at things, like with Kepler's laws, we're into square roots and, you know, things like that, and we model things in that way where when we are reconstructing the knowledge of the ancients, primarily we are looking at basic calendar cycles, and there's not really anything massively advanced out there, unless it's been suppressed, you know, that we can look at. So we are looking at calendar cycles and mythologies and trying to decode the mythological stories to see what celestial events they're talking about and how they might tie in to their calendar systems, which we suspect are tracking these future end-of-age events where we have great disruption to the solar system periodically. You mentioned some of the calendars of the to do with Venus. I mean, would you like me to go into that a bit in the Pleiades you mentioned as well?
I just am looking at the clock. Okay, we have about 10 minutes. So we have about 10 minutes. Where would you like to go? Because you've covered so much, and I feel like we've just really still only covered the surface. Hang on, let me look at my paper to see if there was any burning question that I had. Oh, yeah. Something that you didn't talk about. I mean, one of the things that I believe is that the ancients, I mean, there was their observational skills, but I feel like they knew a lot of stuff that in modern times we're just now figuring out, or, you know, the extraterrestrials are just, filling us back in on, one or the other. Where do you think they got it from, or how do you think, where do you think their level of knowledge was? Because I feel like, all right, I like the precession of the equinoxes, it moves 1 degree, every 70 years, 72 years. And I've asked people about that. It's like, how did they measure it? An average lifespan wasn't 70 years. And they go, well, they would put a stick on the ground and move it every 1 degree. And I'm thinking, right. I have gone definitely to the keep it simple. And I feel like they could not have gotten that advanced kind of knowledge just by sheer observation, or at least not over the very short period of time starting in about 3500 BC. So where do you think the knowledge came from for them to come up with such deep mathematics and deep observations of celestial bodies?
Well, again, it goes to the very idea of an advanced civilization, prior to recorded history, and extraterrestrial contact at various points, to what may well be civilizations which are very low in number, in terms of a human presence on the Earth, civilizations which may outwardly be primitive. I mean, a lot of the texts talk about the Great Fall, if you will, when we had very advanced knowledge, and when human beings themselves personally had, you could say, magical powers, if you will, and that was normal. Like telepathy, the ability to either read minds or move objects or even create things using the power of the mind. There are stories about this power being abused and literally taken away from people, right? Literally taken away. There's a nice, lovely book called A Dweller on Two Planets, which was published in the late 18th century. That goes into that. But also, I would say, extraterrestrial contact is a part of it. And Zecharia Sitchin, if I might look at some of his work, he actually said that the Sumerians, Babylonians, in their clay tablets, which have survived and been excavated from the late 19th, early 20th centuries, they actually explicitly stated that they received their advanced knowledge from the gods, if you will. So he's looking at it in that way. We also might think about, the Mayan long count again. We talk about civilization periodically suffering massive catastrophes. So, for example, the long count is dated to have, the current great cycle is synchronized as a starting point in 3114 BC. There are scientists that have looked at the geophysical record of magnetism in rocks and so forth, and they've been able to work out that, and again, it's per the work of, I'm just trying to remember his name. I think he's lost, but it was in the Mediterranean, and he demonstrated that it was a massive meteor strike in the Mediterranean about 3150 BC. And some of the stories saying, like the Kolbrin, you may have heard of the Kolbrin collection, again, ancient texts. They talk about disasters in Egypt in particular, and also they talk about things going on in Britain as well. And they mention, great portents in the heavens, a strange comet raining down ashes and so forth. And again, we can think about comets drawing in material from the asteroid belt in our direction. And there's a lot of work by Victor Klube and Bill Napier, astronomers, looking at some of these very things about how we've been struck by comets, by special types of exotic comets, or unusually large and so forth, periodically coming into the system, and they are responsible for essentially indirectly harming us by drawing other material to impact us. I mean, what happened in Russia just recently, February the 15th, and they talk about events like that, or even Tunguska in Russia in 1908. You can get smallish type objects in size that can hit the Earth, and it's like the equivalent of a nuclear explosion. So if you had several of those, it's like undergoing a nuclear war type scenario. So I do think that we've had points in time where we've had to pick ourselves back up after a major disaster, and like Plato says, begin again as children, to relearn everything. And so I think to an extent we are again in an age where our technology is advancing, maths is advancing, physics, it's advancing, and we're now beginning to reconstruct some of the science of these ancient civilizations. It's again coming into general usage in throughout the world. We've got cars, planes. We can fly again. I mean, we couldn't fly just over 100 years ago. We couldn't fly, could we? Radio communications a couple hundred years ago, nothing. So we are again, I think, rediscovering these things. And again, there may well come times when there'll be a massive disaster, and once more, the technologies that we have will almost pass into myth, into folklore, and then it'll be another generation that'll have to come along and read our writings, what might survive, and again, reconstruct it again. I think that we may well have extraterrestrials visiting us, passing along certain knowledge, maybe even, in fact, most likely, we're not just talking extraterrestrials, but maybe beings from other dimensions. So I think there's that aspect to it as well. But I think the knowledge, as I said, it's always there, and we're having to reconstruct it. Sometimes it's passed to us, and sometimes we've got to relearn it again from scratch.
Good answer. I mean, one of the things that I find very compelling talking about that meteor strike that you were just talking about is, if it was just culture starting in the Middle East, I mean, we find a resurgence, the Sumerians started, we have Egypt right on the tail, the Indus Valley right around the same time, the big Stonehenge and some of the different structures, early structures there. But then we have that parallel in, the Mayan calendar, which gives you basically the same date. In the Hindu text, it's the beginning of the Kali Yuga with the when Krishna leaves the earth, basically the same date. And then where it got really interesting for me was the Jewish calendar. I mean, because they still honor their traditional calendar, and okay, it might be corrupted here or there as far as the actual dating of the, like year one kind of thing. But that still dates to 3700 BC. So it still kind of puts you in that general 3500 BC plus or minus 500 year date of a new beginning, a new creation, a new start. And I find it very compelling when you find multiple cultures all referring to the same event, even though you don't necessarily know what the event is.
I think these end-of-age transitions are more linked into celestial conjunctions. Right? Conjunctions or alignments between planets than they are so much precession. In fact, I'll even tell you this much. You may have heard about celestial ages, if you will. What marks them? Well, obviously, over here in Europe, we've got our kings and queens, our monarchs, and when one dies, the next one is crowned, right? Mm-hmm. Well, remember that story about the creation of the asteroid belt? It involved basically Phaeton, who is the child of the sun. He takes control of his father's chariot, right? Takes control of his father's chariot for one day, and he loses control in the sky, so he burns up the earth and so forth. And what happens is Jupiter, the father of the gods, or Zeus, destroys him with a thunderbolt, right? Now, what happened in this story is Phaeton goes to visit his father in his father's palace, and because Phaeton is the son of the sun god, right? He is his successor. And according to Ovid's mythology, and he wrote up this story, Ovid's a Roman poet, he crowns his son with the rays of the sun, right? His son with the rays of the sun that gives light. And he gets into his chariot. The very word Phaeton means chariot. And as he's disrupting the solar system because he can't keep hold of it, he gets destroyed by Jupiter, which is Zeus. Now, if you are the planet Jupiter and you look directly at the sun,
Keith, I hate to say this because your story is really interesting, but they're giving me the We need to go. Actually, like we already are probably over. So tell people if they want to get to your website or if they want to get a copy of your book, get a hold of you, just very quickly, please.
My website's called ancientworldmysteries.com, and it's dashes between the words, ancient-world-mysteries.com. And my book is The Lost Age of High Knowledge, and my YouTube channel is called Light Descent, and that's all one word. And you see some of the videos on there from what I've been discussing here with visuals and some of the mathematics in case, it might have been hard for me to explain on radio.
Excellent. Keith, you're fascinating. And I wish we had more time, but we got to go.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for coming back on. We should just have you come back on to continue our conversation.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's Keith Hunter. His webpage is ancientworldmysteries.com. That's ancient-world-mysteries.com. His book is The Lost Age of High Knowledge. Next week, we're going to have Tom Carey and Don Smith in the first hour talking about the real Area 51, the Area 21. I don't think so. And then in the second hour, we're going to be speaking to Jim Self about mastering alchemy. So until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember, it's all just energy.